2 years before D-Day, on a gray August morning on a French beach called Dieppe, a Canadian sapper ran out from behind a burning tank carrying a canvas satchel packed with explosive. He had about 60 yards to cross. The beach was made of loose, round shingle, the kind of stones that roll under your boots and slow you to a stumble, and every one of those 60 yards was covered by machine guns firing from concrete emplacements cut into the cliffs on either side of the town. He was not attacking. He was not carrying a rifle. His job was to reach a concrete anti-tank barrier at the top of the promenade, place the charge, pull the fuse, and get away. Because until that barrier came down, not a single Churchill tank was getting off that beach and into the streets of Dieppe. He did not reach it. Neither did the man who went after him, or the man after that. By the end of the morning, the Allies had lost more than 3,500 men in 9 hours, most of them Canadian, and the tanks that were supposed to punch inland were sitting on the shingle with their tracks broken and their crews dead inside them, or fighting from where they sat until the ammunition ran out. Not one of them got past the seawall obstacles. The raid failed for a lot of reasons, and historians have been arguing about most of them ever since. But there was one lesson from Dieppe so simple and so brutal that nobody argued about it at all. If you want to blow a hole in German concrete, somebody has to carry the explosive to the concrete. And that somebody is a man, on foot, in the open, in front of machine guns that were sighted specifically to kill him. That was the problem. Not a shortage of courage, not a shortage of explosive. The delivery method. The British Army had spent 3 years and a great many lives learning that the last 40 yards between a demolition charge and a bunker wall was the deadliest ground in Europe, and no amount of training or bravery was going to change the arithmetic. Somebody had to solve it, and the solution, when it finally arrived, was so ugly and so ridiculous looking that German soldiers laughed out loud the first time they saw it coming out of the surf. They stopped laughing very quickly. To understand why the answer looked the way it did, you have to understand what German concrete actually was, because there is a habit in popular history of treating a bunker as a sort of thick wall, and it was nothing of the sort. A mature Atlantic wall position was engineered the way a bank vault is engineered. The standard construction used walls and roofs 2 meters thick, poured in a single continuous pour so there were no seams to exploit, laced through with steel reinforcing bar that turned the whole structure into one enormous interlocked block rather than a stack of separate surfaces. The firing embrasure was not a window. It was a narrow slit, often stepped and angled so that a shell arriving from the front would glance off rather than enter, and the gun inside it was frequently sighted to fire not out to sea at all, but sideways along the beach, so that the face presenting itself to an attacker coming from the water was blank concrete with a wall of sand and rubble piled in front of it. Everything about it was designed around one assumption. The attacker will come from the front, and the attacker will have guns, and the guns did not work. This is the part that surprises people, because we have a mental image of a tank rolling up and simply blasting a bunker into rubble, and it very rarely happened that way. A tank gun of that era was built to defeat armor plate, and armor plate and reinforced concrete fail in completely different ways. An armor-piercing shot is a dense metal dart that concentrates enormous energy into a very small point and pushes through. Against 3 inches of hardened steel, that works beautifully. Against 2 meters of reinforced concrete, it drills a neat hole a few feet deep, gets caught in the rebar, and stops. The crew inside hears a bang and feels the floor jump. That is all. High explosive was better, but not by nearly as much as you would hope. A conventional field shell carries a relatively small explosive filling inside a thick steel case, because the case has to be strong enough to survive being fired down a barrel at supersonic speed. A 25-pounder shell, the backbone of British artillery, carried something under 2 pounds of explosive in a case weighing 25. It detonates on contact, and the blast goes where blast always goes, which is outward into open air, the path of least resistance. It chips the face. It scours the sand off. It kills anybody standing outside. The men inside, behind 2 meters, are fine, So you fall back on the traditional answers, and each one fails for its own reason. Naval gunfire can flatten almost anything, but a battleship firing from 10 miles out cannot see a specific embrasure and cannot drop a shell on it with the precision you need, and the moment your own infantry are within a few hundred yards, the guns have to lift or start killing them. Heavy bombers can theoretically obliterate a strong point, and on the morning of the 6th of June, the bombers assigned to the American sector released a few seconds late through cloud and put their entire load into fields several miles inland, killing cows and leaving the beach defenses untouched. Field artillery works, but it needs observation, survey, communication, and time. And time is the one thing an assault does not have. Engineers with satchel charges work when they get there, which is the Dieppe problem again, going round in a circle. What the British needed was something that could sit 50 yards from a bunker, in the open, under fire, absorb whatever the position could throw at it, and put a demolition charge against that wall without a human being walking it there. Not artillery, not a tank gun, a way of throwing the sapper's satchel. That is genuinely the whole idea, and I think it is the single most useful sentence you can hold in your head when you look at the strange machine that came out of it. Every account describes the thing as a gun, and it looks like a gun in the loosest possible sense, but it was never trying to be one. It was a catapult for the charge that a man used to have to carry. The man who made the whole program possible had, at the moment the idea was needed most, been thrown out of the army. Percy Hobart was one of the most original military minds Britain produced in the 20th century, and he was also, by universal agreement, including that of the people who admired him, extremely difficult to work with. He had come up through the Royal Engineers, transferred to tanks in the 20s, when tanks were regarded as an amusing sideshow, and by the early 30s, he was one of a small group of officers arguing that armored forces should be concentrated, independent, fast, and given their own objectives, rather than being sprinkled among the infantry as mobile pillboxes. This was correct. It was also an insult to a generation of senior officers who had built their reputations on the opposite view, and Hobart delivered it with all the tact of a hammer. He argued with superiors. He was contemptuous of people he thought were slow. He wrote reports that were right and unforgivable in equal measure. In 1938, he was sent to Egypt to raise the mobile force that would eventually become the 7th Armored Division, the Desert Rats. He trained them hard, insisted on realistic exercises, drove everybody to exhaustion, and in 1939 was removed from command and sent home. In March 1940, with Britain 7 weeks away from the fall of France, the army retired him. Not a posting. Not a sideways move. Out. So Hobart, who 6 months earlier had been shaping the formation that would carry the Desert War, joined the Home Guard in Gloucestershire as a lance corporal, and spent the summer of the Battle of Britain standing on a country road in a tin hat, waiting for German paratroopers with a rifle and a handful of middle-aged volunteers. There is a photograph, and I find it genuinely painful to look at. This was the most advanced armored thinker in the country, and he was on gate duty. The military correspondent Basil Little Hart wrote about it in the newspapers. Churchill read it, made inquiries, and got the answer that the army did not want Hobart back. Churchill's response was one of the more useful things he did in the entire war. He wrote to the chief of the Imperial General Staff, pointing out that armies do not win wars only with the officers everybody likes, that difficult men are often difficult precisely because they see things others cannot, and that discarding one because he had a rough tongue was an indulgence Britain could not afford. Hobart came back. He raised the 11th Armored Division, was nearly removed again on grounds of age and health, survived that too, and in the spring of 1943 was given the 79th Armored Division and a brief unlike any other in the British Army. The brief was this: there is going to be an invasion. It is going to hit the most heavily fortified coastline ever built. Conventional tanks cannot solve the problems on that coastline. Find out what can, build it, and do not worry about whether it looks like a tank. Hobart was 58 years old, had been a lance corporal 2.5 years earlier, and had just been handed the most interesting job in the British Army. He took it apart with terrifying energy, He gathered engineers, inventors, tankmen, and Royal Engineers officers who had been at Dieppe and knew exactly what had gone wrong there, and he made them work backwards from the beach. Not from the equipment they had, from the obstacles they would meet, in the order they would meet them, from the waterline to the exit road, and for each obstacle he demanded a machine. Mines? A tank with a rotating drum on arms out front, hung with heavy chains, beating the ground to detonate mines ahead of the tracks. That became the crab. Soft blue clay behind the sand that would bog a tank to its belly. A tank carrying an enormous roll of reinforced matting on a frame, unrolling a carpet in front of itself as it went. The bobbin. Anti-tank ditches. A tank carrying a huge bundle of chestnut palings on its nose, driving to the edge, dropping the bundle in, and driving over. The fascine, a Roman engineering answer bolted onto a 20th century chassis. Seawalls too high to climb? A tank pushing a 30-foot bridge ahead of it on a frame, laying it against the wall, and letting the rest of the squadron drive up and over. Wire, hedgerows, entrenched infantry, and the general problem of positions that would not surrender. A Churchill towing an armored trailer full of pressurized fuel, capable of throwing a rod of burning liquid over 100 yards. The crocodile. German prisoners taken later in the campaign would talk about that one with a particular flatness in the voice. They were called Hobart's funnies, and the name was originally an insult. British crews seeing them for the first time made the same jokes the Germans would later make. They were ungainly, cluttered, covered in improbable machinery, and they made a mockery of the sleek fighting vehicles the crews had trained on. And in the middle of that collection sat the vehicle this story is actually about, because the funnies could clear a path across a beach, but a path is no good if the exit is covered by a strong point that is still shooting. Something had to be able to kill concrete, and it had to do it in the first minutes of the landing, not in the first hours. The answer came out of a corner of British weapons development that was, even by the standards of the period, eccentric. In 1940, a retired officer named Stuart Blacker had been developing a weapon for the Home Guard based on a principle called the spigot mortar, and it is worth stopping on this, because the principle is the entire reason the thing in this story exists. Every ordinary gun works the same way. You have a tube. You put a projectile inside the tube and a propellant charge behind it. The charge burns, gas pressure builds, and because the projectile is the only thing that can move, it gets pushed down the tube and out. The tube does two jobs. It contains the pressure and it aims the shot. And it imposes one absolute limit that no amount of engineering can get around, which is that the projectile can never be wider than the hole. If you want a bigger shell, you need a bigger bore, and a bigger bore needs thicker walls to contain a larger charge, and thicker walls mean crushing weight. A gun that could fire a projectile a foot across would be a siege weapon that took a team of horses and half a day to emplace. A spigot mortar turns the whole arrangement inside out. Instead of a tube with a projectile inside it, you have a solid steel rod, the spigot, pointing at the sky. The projectile has a hollow tail tube that slides down over the rod like a sleeve over an arm, and the propellant charge sits inside that tail tube, in the bomb, not in the launcher. When you fire, the charge burns inside the bomb's own tail, and the pressure pushes the bomb off the rod and into the air. The launcher is not containing anything. It is a peg. And because the bomb sits over the rod rather than inside a bore, the width of the bomb is limited by absolutely nothing except how much weight you are prepared to throw. You can hang a projectile the size of a beer keg off a rod that a strong man could carry because all the violence happens in the bomb. That is the trick. That is why this weapon could exist, and a conventional equivalent could not. The British had already used the principle in the PIAT, the infantry anti-tank weapon, that let a man in a ditch throw a shaped charge at a tank, and they had used it in the Blacker Bombard, an ungainly home guard contraption on a concrete pedestal that had been sitting in village crossroads all through 1940, waiting for an invasion that never came. Now take that principle and scale it up until it is absurd, and bolt it into the turret of a tank. The vehicle they chose was the Churchill, and this was not sentiment. The Churchill was slow and it was not a distinguished gun tank, but it had two qualities that mattered more than speed. It had heavy armor, and it could climb obstacles and gradients that would defeat almost anything else on tracks, which is exactly what you want in a machine that has to crawl up a shingle bank under fire. Stripped of its usual gun and fitted out for the Royal Engineers, it became the AVRE. Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers. Not a tank in the normal sense at all, but a sapper's toolbox on tracks, crewed by 6 men, one of whom was a Royal Engineers Demolition NCO, whose job description involved a great deal more than pulling a trigger. In the turret, where the 6-pounder used to be, they mounted the spigot mortar. 290 millimeters, just over 11 inches. It looked wrong. Everybody who saw it said so. A tank gun is long, tapered, and elegant, and it announces reach. This was a short, fat, blunt cylinder sticking out of the mantlet like a length of drain pipe, so stubby that from the front the vehicle looked as though someone had sawn its gun off in the night and welded a bucket over the stump as a joke. The bomb it threw was worse. 40 pounds of it, wide and cylindrical and flat-nosed, with a little tail tube behind, and it looked so exactly like a domestic rubbish bin that the crews named it before anybody official could. The Flying Dustbin. The name stuck so completely that the official designation is the one nobody remembers. Inside that dustbin was somewhere over 25 pounds of high explosive, and I want to put that number next to the earlier one, because that comparison is the whole point. A 25-pounder field shell carried under 2 pounds. A German 88 firing high explosive carried about 2 as well. The Flying Dustbin carried more than 12 times that, and it could carry it because it did not have to survive being fired down a barrel. It was not a shell. It was a demolition charge with a short life in the air. The casing was thin, because the casing did not have to do anything except hold the explosive together for the 4 seconds of the journey. And the journey was slow. Really slow. It came out with a noise nothing like a gun, a hollow, booming thump like a mallet on an oil drum, and then the bomb went up and over in a lazy arc at something like the speed of a thrown cricket ball. Men watching could follow it with the naked eye. It rotated slightly. It seemed almost to hang. The range was pitiful by any normal standard. 80 yards was the effective distance, with a maximum somewhere around 230 if you were lucky and did not much care where it landed. 80 yards. A tank gun of the period could kill at 1,500. So on paper, on a comparison chart of the kind that gets published in books about tanks, the Petard is one of the worst weapons of the Second World War. Terrible range. Terrible velocity. Terrible accuracy at anything beyond spitting distance. The comparison chart is measuring the wrong thing. The Petard was never in competition with tank guns. It was in competition with a man running across a beach with a satchel. And against that competitor, it was the greatest improvement in the history of military engineering. Because the man had to cross 60 yards in the open and the AVRE could stop at 80 and stay buttoned up. Now, the reloading. Almost every telling of this story gets this wrong, and it has been repeated so often that it has hardened into fact, so I want to deal with it properly, because the men who did this job deserve an accurate record. You will read that a crewman had to climb out of the tank, walk around to the front under fire, and shove the next bomb into the muzzle by hand. Some versions describe it as suicidal. It is a wonderful, horrible image, and it is not what happened. The mortar was hinged. To reload, the gunner broke the barrel and pivoted it forwards and down until the muzzle was pointing at the tank's own front deck, right above the co-driver's position. The demolition NCO sitting inside slid open a hatch in the hull roof, lifted the 40-pound dustbin, and pushed it up into the muzzle from inside the vehicle, arms briefly out through the hatch, body inside the armor. The mortar was then swung back up, and it was ready. That is genuinely awkward. It is heavy, cramped work with a 40-pound object in a space designed for a man to sit in, and doing it while the hull is being hit by small arms takes a particular kind of nerve. A practiced crew could manage it in well under a minute. Under fire, in a lurching vehicle, on a beach, it took longer. And a minute is an extraordinarily long time when you are the only thing on a shingle bank that is not lying down. But it usually did not matter. because of what the first round did. Here is what happens when 25 pounds of explosive arrives against reinforced concrete, and it is not what an ordinary shell does, in a way that goes beyond simply being bigger. An ordinary shell detonates at a point and the blast expands outward, and most of that energy goes into the air, because air moves and concrete does not. A very large charge sitting flush against the surface at the moment of detonation does something different. The concrete cannot get out of the way fast enough. The shock front is driven into the material itself and travels through it as a compression wave, crosses the thickness of the wall, reaches the far side, and reflects back as a tension wave. And concrete is superb in compression and pathetic in tension. It is happy being squeezed, and it comes apart being pulled. So the inside face of the wall fails first. It does not crack. It bursts inward, throwing off slabs and fragments at lethal speed into a room that has just become a sealed box full of flying concrete. This is called spalling, and it is why the reinforcing bar does not save you. The rebar is there to stop something punching through. It does nothing at all about a pressure wave traveling through the material it is embedded in. The stronger and more monolithic you build the structure, the better it transmits the shock to everybody inside it. And then there is the second thing, which is that a bunker has a front and a back. The front is 2 meters thick, angled, protected, buried in sand. The back has a door, and a ventilation trunk, and a rear entrance for the crew, and a rear wall that is thinner than the front because nobody expected an attacker to be standing behind it. The German designers were not fools. They simply assumed that anything capable of hurting the structure would be arriving from the sea. The AVRE's job, over and over again in the campaign that followed, was to get around the side and put a dustbin through the back door. A weapon that kills the men inside a bunker is a serious problem for a defender. A weapon that makes the bunker itself the thing that kills them is a different order of problem altogether, and this is the part of the story I keep turning over, because it is not really about engineering. Everything a soldier on the Atlantic Wall had been told rested on one idea. The concrete protects you. That is the arrangement. You stand in a place where you cannot run, where your position is fixed and known and cannot be moved, and in exchange for giving up all your mobility, you get walls that nothing can get through. It is a bargain, and it is a bargain that holds a defensive line together, because a man who believes his position is safe will stay in it under bombardment that would otherwise break him. Take that away, and the whole structure of the defense comes apart, not physically, but in the heads of the men holding it. If the walls do not protect you, then you are not in a fortress. You are in a box, with one exit, that a slow-moving vehicle can walk up to and collapse on top of you. Every advantage the position gave you inverts. The thick roof that stopped the bombs is now the thing that will be lying on your chest. The narrow embrasure that kept the shrapnel out is now the reason nobody will hear you. I do not think you can overstate what that does to a defensive scheme built entirely out of fixed positions. None of this was taken on trust, incidentally. Before any of it went near a landing craft, the British built their own Atlantic Wall to shoot at. Along the empty coasts and firing ranges of Wales, Suffolk, and Norfolk, engineers poured full-scale replicas of German emplacements to the correct specification, with the correct thickness, the correct steel, the correct angled embrasures, and then spent months methodically destroying them to find out what worked. That is where the numbers in this story came from. Not from theory, from a lot of ruined concrete, and a lot of careful men with notebooks measuring exactly how far the inside face of a wall had traveled. The crews who would use the things trained in the same obsessive way, mostly in secret, mostly wet. Assault squadrons of the Royal Engineers rehearsed the whole sequence over and over on British beaches through the winter and spring, in the dark, in the cold, in the rain, with live explosive and real obstacles, until every man knew his own 30 seconds of the plan without being told. Come down the ramp, cross the wet sand. Deal with the obstacle in front of you, whatever it is. Get off the beach. Do it again tomorrow. They were, in a way that I think gets lost, not tank crews at all. They were sappers who happened to be sitting inside armor, and their job on the 6th of June was not to fight a battle. It was to do construction work at high speed in the worst possible conditions, and to keep doing it while people shot at them, and if enough of them managed that for long enough, the infantry behind them would have somewhere to go. The offer was made to everybody. This is the part that has produced 80 years of uncomfortable argument. Hobart demonstrated the full range of the 79th Armored Division's machines to the senior Allied commanders in the spring of 1944, and the offer was straightforward. Take them. Take the crabs, the crocodiles, the AVREs, the fascines, the bridges. Take the crews with them if you want, because they are already trained. The British took them. The Canadians took them. The Americans took the swimming DD tank, which was in fact an idea from the same stable, and declined essentially everything else. The reasons were not stupid, and I want to be fair to the men who made the decision, because it is very easy to be clever about this from 80 years away. The AVRE and the Crocodile were built on the Churchill hull, and the U.S. Army did not operate Churchills. Adopting them meant adopting a new vehicle, a new spares chain, new maintenance training, and new crew training, in the last few weeks before the largest amphibious operation ever mounted, at a point when every hour of every unit's schedule was already allocated. American assault doctrine placed its faith in engineer demolition teams, supported by overwhelming naval and air bombardment, and there was a widespread and genuine confidence that the bombardment would do the job. There was also, undeniably, some institutional reluctance to arrive on the beach in somebody else's peculiar machinery. And then there was Omaha. The two American beaches were not the same. Utah went comparatively well, partly through luck, partly because the current pushed the first wave to a lightly held stretch of coast, and the man on the spot had the sense to carry on from there rather than correct back to the plan. Omaha was the other thing entirely. Omaha was 4 miles of open sand backed by a shingle bank, then a seawall, then bluffs 150 feet high, and the only ways off the beach were 5 ravines, every one of which was covered by prepared positions in enfilade. The bombers missed. The rocket ships fired short. 27 of the 29 swimming tanks launched in front of the eastern half of the beach were launched too far out into water that was too rough, and they went down with their crews within minutes of leaving the landing craft, which meant that the infantry arrived with almost no armor at all. And the German troops holding the position were better than the intelligence estimates said they were. So the first waves came ashore into positions that were entirely intact, with no tanks, and with the engineers who were supposed to blow the obstacles being killed as they worked, exactly as at Dieppe, exactly as always. Men crossed 300 yards of open sand at low tide and lay against the shingle bank because there was nowhere else in the world to go, and the ones who eventually got off the beach did it by climbing the bluffs between the defended ravines, in small groups, led by whoever was still standing. Casualties on Omaha that day ran to something like 2,000 and more. On Golden Sword, where the AVREs came in with the first waves and started punching exits open within minutes of touching down, the figures were a fraction of that. I want to be careful here, because the tempting version of this story is that the Americans refused the funnies and paid for it in blood, and that version is too neat to be honest. Omaha was murderous because of terrain, tide, cloud, a misjudged bomber run, a bad decision about where to launch the swimming tanks, and a German division nobody had properly accounted for. Take all of that together, and Omaha would have been the hardest beach of the 6, even with a full regiment of Hobart's machinery on it. What the AVREs would have changed is narrower and more specific than the popular version, but it is not nothing. They would have given the men on that shingle bank something that could sit in front of an emplacement and demolish it, at the exact hour when there was nothing else on the beach that could. Whether that saves 500 men or 50, nobody can say, and anybody who gives you a number is guessing. What is not in doubt is that the offer was made, in writing, in time, and turned down. Most of the men in this story never appear in it by name. The sapper at Dieppe with the satchel, the demolition NCO shoving a 40-pound bomb up through a hatch at Le Hamel, the American rifleman climbing a bluff between 2 ravines. They exist in the record as initials in a war diary, a number in a casualty return, a line on a movement order. But the record is enormous, and most families never learn how much of it survives. If you have a name, an old photograph, a box of things nobody ever explained, there is a way to work back through it, and I wrote a guide to doing exactly that for American servicemen, step by step, from almost nothing. It is called Find Your Grandfather's War, and it is linked below. Because that is what the records are for. Not sentiment. Recovery. On the morning of the 6th of June, roughly 120 AVREs went ashore on the 3 eastern beaches, and the pattern was the same in each place. They landed with the first or second wave, in among the leading infantry, which meant they were being shot at from the moment the ramps went down, and had none of the protection a normal armored attack would expect. They took losses immediately, to mines, to anti-tank guns, to drowning. And where they got up the beach, exits opened. At La Hamel, on Gold Beach, there was a strong point built into a former sanatorium, and it was the most stubborn position on the whole British sector. Its guns were sighted to fire along the beach rather than out to sea, which meant the naval bombardment had gone over the top of it and left it untouched, and it held up the assault for most of the day and killed a great many men of the Hampshire Regiment. It was not knocked out from the front. In the afternoon, an AVRE worked round to the rear of the building and put dustbins into the back of it at close range, and the resistance stopped. That is the weapon doing precisely and literally the job it was designed for, 10 hours late and after a lot of dead men, and it is worth noting that the delay was because there had not been an AVRE available at that spot in the first hour, not because the method failed. On Sword, the assault squadrons landed with the leading infantry into a beach still under heavy fire and started work on the seawall and the exits immediately, laying matting, dropping fascines into the anti-tank ditch, blowing the concrete blocks that sealed the beach roads. The men of those squadrons were doing engineering work, under machine gun fire, in daylight, at walking pace. On Juno, the Canadians came in against a seawall and hit it with the same combination, and the Canadian beach exits were open and traffic was moving inland while the fighting for the villages behind was still going on. None of these beaches were easy. Juno in particular cost the Canadians heavily in the first 30 minutes, and it is not the case that the funnies made an assault landing safe, because nothing does. What they did was compress time. The difference between clearing a beach exit in 20 minutes and clearing it in 6 hours is the difference between an army that is inland by lunchtime and an army that is still lying on the sand at dusk with the tide coming in behind it, and reinforcements arriving in front. After Normandy, the AVREs kept going, and in some ways the rest of the campaign suited them better than the beach had. Northwest Europe in the autumn of 1944 was a war of fortified towns, and the Germans had a great talent for turning a stone farmhouse, a customs post, or a row of terraced houses into something that could hold up a battalion for a day. The AVRE's answer to a fortified building was to drive up to the front of it and remove the front of it. At Le Havre, at Boulogne, at Calais, on Walcheren, in the concrete of the Siegfried Line, and finally on the Rhine, the 79th Armored Division's vehicles went in with the assault, and the same short, blunt, ridiculous tube kept doing the same thing. And the German response to it, by the end, was not a tactical counter. There was no counter. There was no way to make a bunker that a demolition charge placed against it would not eventually break, short of building it so thick that you could not afford to build very many. What happened instead is what happens to any defensive system that stops being believed in. Positions that would have been held to the last round in 1941 were abandoned or surrendered when armor appeared and started closing in, because the men inside had worked out something their doctrine did not allow for. You can fight in the open and have a chance. You cannot fight from inside a box that is about to become your grave, and staying put was no longer courage, it was simply a slower form of dying. The Atlantic Wall consumed something like 17 million cubic meters of concrete and years of forced labor, and its designers had built it against the war they expected, which was ships and aircraft and guns. It was never seriously tested by the thing that actually beat it, which was a man in a Churchill tank driving up to 80 yards with a thrown satchel charge and a lot of patience. Percy Hobart did not get much out of it. He was knighted during the war, and he ended it as a major general, which is where he had started, and the 79th Armored Division was disbanded in the summer of 1945, and its machines were scrapped, sold, or left to rust. He never received the higher command his abilities warranted, and the establishment that had thrown him out in 1940 was never especially keen to dwell on the fact that the man they had discarded had come back and solved the invasion's hardest technical problems. He died in 1957. The funnies are a footnote in most general histories of the war, usually illustrated with a photograph of a crab flailing chains, captioned as a curiosity. I think that is the wrong reading of him, and I think it is the wrong reading of the machine. The Petard was not an eccentric British oddity that happened to work. It was the correct engineering answer to a problem that had been defined precisely, at Dieppe, in blood, 2 years earlier, by men who died carrying explosives across shingle. Somebody looked at that and asked the only question that mattered, which was not how do we make a bigger gun, but how do we get the charge to the wall without a man attached to it. Everything else, the spigot, the dustbin, the hinged barrel, the six-man crew, the slow lazy arc through the morning air, is just the answer to that question worked out in steel. A German soldier on the Atlantic Wall in the first hour of the 6th of June, looking out of a firing slit at something coming out of the surf with a stub of pipe where its gun should be, could not possibly have known any of that. What he saw was a joke. A tank that had lost its gun. Something wrong and clumsy and slightly funny, wallowing up the sand towards him behind 2 meters of concrete that had been poured specifically to make him safe from things much more impressive than that. The laughing did not last long. The tube came round. There was a hollow thump, nothing like a gun, more like somebody hitting an empty barrel with a hammer, and something large and round came up out of the beach smoke, turning slowly over, slowly enough to watch, slowly enough that a man had time to stop laughing and start understanding. And then 2 meters of reinforced concrete, poured in one continuous pour, laced with steel, faced with sand, angled against naval gunfire and proof against high explosive shells and armor-piercing shot, and everything the designers had ever imagined arriving from the sea, came apart from the inside. They called it the Dustbin. It was the last thing a lot of men on that coast ever found funny.